When we begin to understand the narcissistic pattern, we have to start with the illusion it depends on the illusion of control. Not control in the obvious, overt sense alone, but a much deeper psychological control over how they are perceived, over what is felt, and most importantly, over what is never allowed to surface. This isn't random or arbitrary. It is a learned adaptation, often rooted in early experiences where vulnerability was unsafe, where authentic emotional expression was not. Met with attunement but with rejection, neglect, or even shame. And so a strategy emerges not consciously chosen, but deeply ingrained to construct a self that cannot be hurt because it does not truly feel. In this constructed self, control becomes everything. Control of the narrative, control of the relationship, control of the emotional distance. And when they encounter someone capable of real love, someone emotionally available, grounded, and empathic, that dynamic begins to stabilize them in ways they often don't understand. The empath becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting back a version of the narcissist that feels coherent, even worthy. But this stability is fragile because it is not internally generated. It depends entirely on maintaining that illusion. Now, what happens when that illusion is threatened? When the person who provided that reflection begins to withdraw, to see more clearly, or to step away entirely? This is where the fracture begins. Because for the narcissistic individual, losing control over how they are seen is not just uncomfortable, it is existential. It challenges the very structure they've built to survive. And here's the paradox. What looks like confidence is often a defense against profound insecurity. What appears as emotional detachment is often a way to avoid overwhelming feelings that were never safely processed. So when real love is lost, not casual attention, not superficial admiration, but genuine, grounded connection, it disrupts the entire system. The usual strategies, charm, manipulation, dismissal, begin to fail. And for perhaps the first time, there's a gap between who they believe themselves to be and what reality is reflecting back. This is not a gentle realization. It can feel like disorientation, like something internally is slipping out of grasp, because control in this context was never about dominance, it was about protection. Protection from feeling small, unworthy, unseen. And without that control, those very feelings begin to surface. But here's the critical point. The breaking of the illusion is not the same as transformation. It is simply the moment where the structure no longer holds as it once did. And in that moment, there is a choice, though it may not feel like one. The mind can double down, reconstruct the illusion, find new sources of validation, reinforce the defenses. Or, in rarer cases, there can be a pause, a moment of recognition. A recognition that what was lost was not just a person, but a connection to something real. And more unsettling than that, a recognition that the loss was not random, it was shaped by their own patterns, their own inability to remain present in vulnerability. This is where the illusion of control truly cracks, not when something external changes, but when the internal narrative can no longer fully suppress reality. And in that fracture lies both the danger and the possibility. Because when control is exposed as illusion, what remains is truth. Truth, for someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding it, can feel unbearable. And yet, it is only in that unbearable moment that something real can begin. If that illusion of control begins to fracture, what often follows is something far more unsettling: the encounter with an emotional void that has been carefully avoided for most of a lifetime. And here we have to be precise, because this void is frequently misunderstood. It is not simply emptiness in the casual sense. It is the absence of a felt, secure connection to oneself. It is the result of a developmental environment where emotional needs were not consistently seen, mirrored, or met. As Dr. Gabor Maté often points out, what we call personality is, in many ways, an adaptation to early conditions. If a child learns that their authentic feelings lead to disconnection rather than closeness, they begin to suppress those feelings. Not because they choose to, but because it is the only way to preserve attachment. Over time, this suppression becomes identity. And what is left underneath is not just hidden, it becomes inaccessible. So when real love enters the picture later in life, it has a unique quality. It does not simply validate the constructed self, it begins, quietly, to invite the authentic self forward, not through force, but through consistency, presence, and emotional safety. And for a time, this can feel stabilizing, even healing. But it also introduces a tension. Because genuine connection asks for something. The narcissistic structure resists emotional openness, mutual vulnerability, and the capacity to stay present with discomfort. When that connection is lost, especially when it is lost because the other person can no longer remain in a one-sided dynamic, the protective layers begin to thin. And what emerges is not clarity, not immediate insight, but a kind of internal disorientation. The distractions that once kept the deeper feelings at bay, attention, admiration, control, no longer have the same effect. There is a quiet, persistent sense that something is missing, but it cannot be easily named. This is the confrontation with the void. And it is important to understand why this moment is so destabilizing. Because the void does not just represent loneliness. It represents disconnection from one's own emotional reality. There is no internal anchor, no stable sense of self that exists independently of external validation. So when the external source disappears, there is nothing to return to, only an unfamiliar silence. In many cases, the immediate response is to escape this feeling, to seek new attention, to recreate the dynamic with someone else, to reassert the familiar patterns. And from the outside, this can look like indifference or even ease. But internally, it is often driven by an urgent need to avoid what feels intolerable, the experience of being alone with oneself, without the usual defenses. But occasionally, something different happens. Not immediately and not comfortably, but gradually. The individual begins to notice the pattern not intellectually alone, but experientially. They begin to sense that the emptiness is not caused by the absence of others, but by a long-standing absence within themselves. And this is not a pleasant realization. It carries grief, confusion, and often a deep sense of regret, because now the loss of the relationship is no longer seen as random or circumstantial. It becomes connected to their own inability to fully engage, to remain present, to receive and reciprocate real love. And this is where the possibility begins, not in resolution, but in awareness. Because once the void is acknowledged, it can no longer be entirely denied. It may still be avoided, still resisted, but something has shifted. The experience has been named, even if only internally. And in that naming, there is the faintest opening. Because the emptiness they fear is not proof that they are unlovable, it is evidence of what was never allowed to grow. And what was never allowed to grow can, under the right conditions, begin again. As that internal void begins to make itself known, we come to another layer of this dynamic that is often overlooked, yet profoundly significant: the role of the other person in regulating the narcissist's inner world. Because what appears, on the surface, to be a relationship of imbalance or even exploitation is, at a deeper level, a kind of emotional dependency that is rarely acknowledged. When someone with strong empathic tendencies enters the life of a narcissistically organized individual, they bring with them a capacity for attunement, patience, and emotional presence. They listen deeply. They tolerate inconsistencies. They try to understand rather than react. And in doing so, they begin to provide something the narcissistic individual has likely never had in a consistent external source of regulation. Now, this is not regulation in the clinical, conscious sense. It is not something either person necessarily names, but it is felt. The empath's steadiness softens the internal chaos. Their validation quiets the underlying insecurity. Their willingness to stay even in moments of tension creates a temporary sense of safety. And over time, this dynamic becomes stabilizing, not because the narcissist has developed internal resilience, but because that resilience is being borrowed from the other person. This is why the connection can feel so intense, even irreplaceable. It is not just emotional attachment, it is psychological reliance. But here is the difficulty. Because this reliance is not consciously recognized, it is often taken for granted. The empath's presence becomes expected rather than valued. Their efforts become invisible. And the narcissistic patterns of defensiveness, control, emotional withdrawal continue to operate, often undermining the very connection that is sustaining them. Until, inevitably, something shifts. The empath begins to see more clearly. They begin to feel the cost of constantly giving without receiving. And at a certain point, they make a decision, not Hebrew mem, Hebrew tav, Hebrew vav, Hebrew kaf, anger alone, but from a deeper recognition of their own limits. They step away, not as a punishment, but as an act of self-preservation. And this is where the true destabilization occurs. Because what is lost is not just a relationship, it is the primary mechanism through which the narcissistic individual has been regulating their emotional state. Without that presence, the internal landscape changes rapidly. The familiar sense of grounding begins to dissolve. Anxiety may increase. Irritability, restlessness, even a sense of internal fragmentation can emerge. And yet, from the outside, this is not always visible. The individual may appear composed, may even move quickly to replace the connection. But internally, there is often a growing awareness that something essential is missing and that it cannot be so easily replicated. Because genuine attunement is not interchangeable. It cannot be manufactured on demand. It develops over time, through trust, through consistency, through emotional investment. And when it is lost, its absence is not just noticed, it is felt in a way that disrupts the entire system. This is the moment where the illusion of independence begins to unravel. The belief that I don't need anyone comes into direct conflict with the lived experience of instability in the absence of that one person who, in truth, had become a psychological anchor. And again, we arrive at a crossroads. One path is to deny this dependency, to seek distraction, to reassert control by finding new sources of validation. The other is far more difficult, to acknowledge that what was lost was not weakness, but support, not control, but connection. Because to admit that is to also admit vulnerability. It is to recognize that beneath the defenses, there is a very human need to be seen, to be held in understanding, to feel emotionally safe in the presence of another. And that recognition can be both humbling and deeply unsettling, because it challenges the entire narrative of self-sufficiency that has been constructed over years, even decades. But it also points, quietly, to something essential. That the stability they experienced was not an illusion. It was real, but it was not internally owned. And until it is, it will always remain at risk of being lost, because what we depend on externally without developing internally will never feel secure. And what is not secure can never truly be held. And when that external anchor is gone, when the distractions no longer fully work, and the internal instability begins to surface, something even more fundamental starts to emerge, something that has been carefully kept out of awareness for most of their lives. That is shame. Now we have to distinguish this carefully, because people often confuse shame with guilt. Guilt says I did something wrong. Shame says there is something wrong with me. And in narcissistic structures, it is not guilt that is most threatening, it is shame. Guilt can be managed, explained away, projected onto others. But shame, when it breaks through, is far more destabilizing because it challenges the very core of identity. As Dr. Gabor Maté has emphasized in his work, shame is not something we are born with. It is something we internalize when our authentic selves are not received with acceptance. When a child's feelings, needs, or expressions are repeatedly met with dismissal or disconnection, the child does not conclude, something is wrong with my environment. They conclude, something is wrong with me. And that conclusion, once formed, does not simply disappear. It gets buried. What we often call narcissism, in this light, is not an excess of self-love, but a defense against this buried shame. The grandiosity, the need for admiration, the emotional distance, these are not signs of inner confidence, but strategies designed to prevent that shame from ever being felt directly. But when the relationship collapses, when someone who offered genuine, consistent love is no longer there, those defenses begin to weaken. Not all at once, and not in a way that is immediately obvious, but gradually the narrative starts to shift. The usual explanations, they were too sensitive, they didn't understand me, they weren't enough, begin to feel less convincing. And in that subtle shift, something else begins to surface. A question, at first, almost imperceptible. What if the loss had something to do with me? Now, this is a dangerous moment for the psyche, because it opens the door to self-reflection, but it also opens the door to shame. And for many, the instinct is to close that door as quickly as possible, to reassert the familiar defenses, to find someone else, to rebuild the narrative in a way that preserves the self-image. But sometimes, that question lingers, and if it lingers long enough, it deepens. It becomes less about the specific relationship and more about a pattern. Not just what did I do wrong, but why do I keep losing what matters? And beneath that, something even more vulnerable begins to take shape. Is there something in me that makes real connection unsustainable? This is where shame begins to emerge not as a dramatic collapse, but as a quiet, persistent undercurrent, a sense of inadequacy that cannot be fully silenced, a recognition, however incomplete, that the loss was not entirely external. And this is profoundly uncomfortable because it strips away the protective illusion of superiority. It replaces it with uncertainty, with self-doubt, with a kind of emotional exposure that feels unfamiliar and unsafe. But it is also, paradoxically, the first moment of potential truth. Because as long as the narrative is entirely external, blaming others, circumstances, timing, there's no possibility of change. The system remains intact, the patterns repeat. But when even a small degree of ownership begins to emerge, something shifts. The defenses may still be there, the resistance may still be strong, but the absolute certainty begins to soften. And in that softening, there is space. Space not only for discomfort, but for insight. Not only for regret, but for understanding. Because shame, when it is not overwhelming, can point towards something real. It can reveal the gap between who one has learned to be and who one might have been under different conditions. Now, this does not mean that the individual suddenly becomes self-aware or transformed. Far from it. The pull to return to old patterns remains powerful. The instinct to avoid pain does not disappear. But the experience of shame, whether it is not completely shut down, leaves an imprint. It introduces a crack in the certainty of the false self. And once that crack exists, it cannot be entirely undone. Because somewhere within, there is now a recognition, however faint, that the loss of real love was not just a misfortune. It was a consequence, and that recognition, as painful as it is, carries within it the seed of responsibility. Because you cannot change what you refuse to see, but once you truly see it, even for a moment, you can no longer claim you didn't know. And when that crack in the self finally appears, when the illusion of control has faltered, when the emotional void has been felt, when the loss of the other has destabilized the system, and when shame has begun to surface, we arrive at a moment that is often misunderstood. People tend to assume that this is where transformation naturally begins. But that assumption is not only inaccurate, it can be misleading, because this moment is not a resolution. It is a crossroads. On one side is the path that has always been there, the path of defense, of avoidance, of reconstructing the familiar identity. And it is important to understand how powerful this pull is. These patterns were not formed randomly. They were developed over years, often decades, as a way to survive emotionally overwhelming environments. So when the system is threatened, it does what it has always done. It tries to restore equilibrium. That might look like seeking new sources of validation, quickly attaching to someone else who can provide the same external regulation. It might look like rewriting the story, minimizing the significance of what was lost, or reframing the other person as flawed or insufficient. It might even look like a temporary period of apparent self-reflection that gradually gives way to the same patterns once the immediate discomfort subsides. This path is not chosen because it is healthy. It is chosen because it is familiar. And familiarity, especially in the realm of psychological survival, often feels safer than truth. But there is another path, one that is far less common and far more demanding. And it does not begin with clarity or confidence. It begins with a willingness to remain in discomfort without immediately escaping it. A willingness to sit with the questions that have emerged, rather than rushing to answer them in a way that restores the old sense of self. As Dr. Gabor Maté has often emphasized, healing is not about becoming something new, it is about recovering what was lost or suppressed. And that recovery requires something the narcissistic structure resists at every level: vulnerability. Not vulnerability as performance, not as a strategy to regain connection, but as a genuine openness to experience one's own emotions, without defense. To feel the grief of what was lost, not just the person, but the possibility of connection that was not sustained. To feel the regret not as self-condemnation, but as recognition. To acknowledge without distortion the impact of one's actions. And this is where accountability enters, not as punishment, but as integration. Because without accountability, there can be no coherence between one's actions and one's understanding. And without that coherence, any attempt at change remains superficial. Now, this path is not linear. There are moments of insight followed by retreat, moments of clarity followed by denial. The old defenses do not disappear simply because they are seen. They continue to operate, often subtly, often convincingly, but something is different now. The experience of awareness, once it has occurred, cannot be entirely erased. And so the individual begins, slowly, to develop something that was previously absent, an internal reference point, not based on external validation, not dependent on another person's presence, but rooted in a growing capacity to observe, to reflect, and to remain present with oneself. This is not dramatic. It is often quiet, even invisible from the outside, but it is foundational, because for the first time, the possibility emerges that connection does not have to come at the cost of authenticity, and that intimacy does not have to be controlled in order to be maintained. And yet, we have to be honest, this path is rare, not because people are incapable of change, but because it requires facing precisely what the original adaptations were designed to avoid. It requires moving toward the pain, rather than away from it. But if that movement can be sustained, even imperfectly, something begins to reorganize. The defenses soften. The emotional range expands. The capacity for genuine connection, first with oneself and then with others, begins to take shape. And at that point, the breaking point is no longer just a collapse. It becomes a threshold, because what was once experienced as loss begins to reveal itself as an invitation not to reclaim what is gone, but to become capable of what was once impossible. And that is the real turning point. Because in the end, the question is not whether the narcissist suffers the consequences of losing real love. The question is whether they are willing to let that loss teach them how to finally receive it.